Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF. And we have a really interesting panel this morning looking at a kind of concept of trade policy that I think is somewhat new. And that's the issue of what we've coined a non-tariff attacks. And we'll be discussing exactly what that means. But it really, at the end of the day, is this emergence over the last decade from non-US countries, foreign countries, to see a core part of their trade and technology policy as attacking and trying to weaken American advanced technology companies. And we believe, this is a violation of World Trade Organization norms and rules, more important norms. And secondly, that this is something now as President Trump is engaged in, very serious negotiations with a lot of countries around their unfair trade practices, practices that frankly the WTO wasn't able to adequately address and discipline. That these kinds of attacks need to be a core part of those negotiations. So we have a great panel today. We'll start out in this order. My colleague Hillel Aka, who is a policy analyst at the ITIF New Aegis Project for Defending U.S. Technology Leadership. So this is a policy and analytical project where we identify these issues and these problems and put forth policy solutions. She works on tech competitiveness. She had a former experience with the Center for New American Security, Technology and National Security program. And she's a former economic consultant on antitrust and competition markets at Charles River Associates. So welcome. After Hillel speaks, we have the Honorable Nazak Nikatar, who is a partner at Wiley Ryan. She has over 20 years experience in international trade and national security to help clients succeed in global and domestic marketplaces. She's the former Department of Commerce Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration. And in the Trump administration, she was also the former Undersecretary of Industry and Security, BIS, at the Department of Commerce, and really focused deeply on all questions around export controls and everything China. So Nazak is extremely deep on these questions, particularly as what China is doing in this space. And then finally, Martin Rasser, who's a Senior Director for Economy at the Special Competitive Studies Program, SCSP. Great organization, just had a fantastic event at the Washington Conference Center last week that I had the honor of moderating a panel on robotics on. He's a former senior fellow and director also at the Center for New American Security, where he focused on technology and national security. He's a former chief of staff at Muddy Waters Capital, and he's a former senior intelligence officer at the CIA, where he worked on foreign emerging technology innovation policies and concerns. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Hillel for a PowerPoint, and then we'll hear from Nazak and then Martin, and then we'll open it up for questions for anyone, comments from the audience. So Hillel, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'll spend a few minutes introducing this new category of trade policy tools called non-tariff attacks. And after my presentation, we'll have our panel discussion about how the United States should respond to these challenges to protect its tech leadership. We can move on to the next slide. So American tech companies are under attack. At ITIF, we've been tracking and documenting regulatory and policy actions targeting American tech companies. And what started in Europe has now spread globally. So this map shows a dramatic expansion. We can move on to the next slide. So in 2010, only a few policies disproportionately impacted US tech companies. But today we see over 100 of these policies proliferating across dozens of jurisdictions worldwide. and countries are actively learning from and copying each other's approaches, especially when they don't face any consequences from the US. You can visit our website, Big Tech Policy Tracker on ITIF's website, if you want to see the full catalog, which is being updated regularly. We can move on. So most countries defend themselves by claiming that these policies are neutral domestic policies addressing legitimate concerns. But this quote from Andreas Schwab, the EU rapporteur for the Digital Markets Act, is actually quite revealing, because he explicitly says that the regulation should focus on the top 5 tech companies, which happen to be all American, and suggested that the EU should not include a European firm just to appease the United States. So this is direct evidence that these policies are designed specifically to target American tech companies. We can move on. And given the scale and spread of these attacks and their impact on the US tech industry and leadership, we think they should be considered a trade policy weapon. So to understand why we need this firm, it's important to see how these attacks are different from traditional policy tools. So historically, countries used tariffs, direct taxes on imports. And after the World War II, trade agreements significantly reduced these tariffs, and countries then developed non-tariff barriers, things like safety standards, licensing requirements, and quotas. These are primarily defensive measures designed to protect domestic markets by restricting access to foreign companies. And actually, the Trump administration correctly identified, for example, obscure car safety standards as trade barriers that need to be addressed in trade talks. And these talks should not just be about tariffs. And these standards might technically be about safety, but they're actually designed to keep foreign cars out of the market. But non-tariff attacks represent something a bit different. Unlike barriers, they're offensive rather than defensive. And they're not primarily intended to protect the domestic industry. Instead, they systematically extract resources from targeted firms or strategically undermine their competitiveness. So this can include things like forced technology transfers, mandatory infrastructure investments, or revenue extraction through massive fines, as we see in the DMA. We can move on. So here are some concrete examples to illustrate the differences. A tariff is obviously a blunt tool. A tariff would be, for example, a 25% tax on imported goods. A non-tariff barrier might be obscure safety certifications. But things like digital service taxes, localization mandates, and digital antitrust regulations, like Digital Markets Act, these are attacks because the primary goal is not to keep the US tech out of the market, but to force them to invest in local infrastructure, for example. Data localization requirements can force companies like Google, Amazon, or Microsoft to build expensive data centers in each country as a condition for providing services there. And another example, the Digital Markets Act, the prime example, usually imposes special obligations on just the designated companies, which are often American companies, and calculate fines and penalties based on global revenue. So this means that a violation in one small market can result in penalties based on worldwide revenue. So for example, Turkey has a proposed DMA bill, and that would allow fines up to 10% of global revenue, despite Turkey being a comparatively small market. We can move on. Here are some of the main types of non-tariff attacks we're seeing, and how widespread they are. As you can see here, the number of jurisdictions. For example, local investment mandates. Currently, 21 jurisdictions have some form of these local investment mandates. Examples include things like, Australia's News Media Bargaining Code or Canada's Online News Act that force American companies to pay local third parties, local news publishers. Things like digital service taxes have revenue thresholds around 250 million euros or like dollars globally that exclude domestic companies while capturing all American companies. 28 jurisdictions now mandate local data storage. A really interesting example is South Korea refusing to share mapping data with Google unless Google builds a local data center there. Like Google Maps works better in North Korea than in South Korea for this reason. And we see, again, DMA-style regulations in almost 25 jurisdictions, each imposing their own compliance requirements and their fine structures based on global revenues. So if you had 10 jurisdictions imposing 5% global revenue fines, you would have a company's, half of their global revenue basically going to fines. It's a massive amount of resources extracted from American tech companies. We can move on, yeah. And the financial impact of these attacks is actually quite significant. This chart shows the distribution of GDPR fines by company country. The General Data Protection Regulation is Europe's comprehensive data privacy law, which came into force in 2018. And since then, US companies paid more than 80% of all GDPR fines. That's almost $12 billion out of $14 billion. To put this in perspective, this amount could fund 5 state-of-the-art data centers in the United States. Another striking example is in 2024 alone, EU fines against US tech companies reached over $6 billion. And this is equivalent to 20% of the EU's entire tariff revenue. And this is clearly, excuse me, this is clearly a significant source of revenue for these countries. We can move on. Yeah. And looking at the broader picture, so since 2015, leading US tech companies, so this is not all US tech companies, this is just the big tech companies, have paid over $31 billion in just antitrust fines globally. And also we see the investigations like spreading across jurisdictions, almost 30 investigations per year across 15 to 20 jurisdictions. A single 2.4 billion penalty on Google for an antitrust violation would be basically an entire investment in a major data center in the US, or it actually equals their strategic funding for Anthropic, a leading AI research lab. So this is capital directly extracted from American innovation and R&D investments. We can move on, yeah. So Trump administration is already addressing unfair trade practices, including tariffs and non-tariff barriers. This is great, but we also should include non-tariff attacks in these negotiations, because the US tech industry is essentially the most important industry if we want to make sure that the US remains competitive against China. And another issue is that these are obviously new policies, so we don't really have a framework for them. So we need this new term, non-tariff attacks, to identify these policies and then include them in trade talks. Another key challenge here is the asymmetry. So for example, when traditional industries are targeted, we can respond in kind. For example, targeting American car manufacturing, would basically have in that scenario, the US would basically respond by targeting European or other car manufacturers. But these countries do not have equivalent tech companies. So we don't have a European Google, or we don't have a Brazilian Apple or a Turkish Amazon. So this asymmetry makes retaliation difficult and makes American tech companies really attractive targets. So it's essential to include these in the comprehensive trade talks so that they can actually be addressed. So I think this is a good point where we can turn to our panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Hillel. That was fascinating. Those PowerPoint will be up on our website. So Nazak, over to you. You've been sort of front and center in this, obviously in the first Trump administration, but also in the work you're doing now in your own practice. Tell us your thoughts, please.
I think it's pretty astounding when and Hilal's presentation was fantastic, to sort of see the magnitude of this discriminatory behavior of countries against the United States. I want to underscore that, Europe, right, is sort of the prime example. Europe is behaving like China in its discriminatory way, it's extracting things from the US. And I want to underscore this point. We don't treat Europe like China. So far, our export controls have been lenient against Europe. Our trade barriers, right? All of that. Our tariffs on Europe versus Europe's tariffs against us. And so it's pretty astounding when we're in this era of this kind of sort of mudslinging against the United States. The other thing I wanted to flag is that, we've reached this point where these countries are retaliating so aggressively against the United States. And they admitted, when I was in the first Trump administration, we talked to Europe about its digital services taxes. And they freely admitted this is to get our companies to grow in the market space, right? And so the notion that they have to aggressively attack an ally, America, who's done nothing but open our markets to Europe, freely export our technology to Europe, for Europe to take this position against America like this was really bothersome. And to Hilal's point, they freely admit it. The other thing is that, international institutions have failed, right? And so I think some of the audience members are going to think, well, why don't we just set up international institutions to deal with this? One, these countries who are engaged in these attacks are not interested in international institutions, are not interested in international institution norms. And it's those same countries that are engaging in these attacks that have twisted the way that these international institutions work to engage in self-preservation than actually doing their jobs. And I'll end with one example. In 2017, we were in Europe talking about China and it's China's behavior and its non-market economy status versus market economy status. And we part of our discussions with Europeans, we also spoke to the WTO head of the trade remedy section. And the WTO representative said that, we can't choose between our two largest members, the United States and China, which signaled to me at that point that WTO was more interested in self-preservation than doing their job. And we see this right now with the WHO, the International Olympic Committee, et cetera, right? And so the natural inclination is going to be to call for international institutions to do something. But it's going to be those same members of these international institutions who are not going who sort of helped the corruption of the international institutions or aided them, who are going to resist. Or if we do set up international institutions, I'm very concerned that it's going to be one-sided. So President Trump is absolutely correct into calling our trading partners out. And, to the extent that people feel like our retaliatory tariffs are not justified, I think Halal made a great point. They're absolutely justified. And frankly, as they've been reduced to sort of the 10%, across the board tariffs right now, frankly, based on Halal's presentation, that isn't even enough. So I guess that goes to the question of what else can we do to compel our allies to act in a more reciprocal way, given the way we have been so open to trading with them.
So, Nizak, before I turn to Martin, let me ask you a follow-on question. And this is sort of a little bit of a ding at us and at the Europeans. One of the things that I find so frustrating, I don't expect the Chinese government officials to have any level of transparency. I mean, they've never, ever admitted that what they're doing is a blatant violation of the World Trade Organization rules and all the norms. They've never admitted that. So I don't expect them to do that. I get it. It's obfuscation. It's lying. I get all that. Call me naive, but I expect Europe, our European friends and allies, I expect them to have some willingness to say, yeah, you're right. We're running a $200 billion trade deficit with you. Yeah, you're right. The DSTs are unfair. Yeah, you're right. The DMA goes too far and these things. And they refuse. I've never met a European official who's willing to cop to any of that. And I think that makes it harder, obviously, to negotiate when you're not even able. But also at the same time, I feel like we could have done a better job in the U.S. government to articulate and lay out a bill of particulars. Now, you got the NTE that I think does a good job of that, the U.S. chair. But anyway, your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, on one hand, I think I could see your point. On the other hand, I want to use one other example that underscores how badly the Europeans behave and how discriminatorily they behave. And this is an area where the U.S. has logged complaints for a long time, and the Europeans have refused to do anything. And it's the auto standards, right? Europe has these highly discriminatory auto standards where we can't, export. It's precluded exports of U.S. sort of passenger vehicles to Europe. Europe also, when it has trade agreements with other countries, it forces those countries to adopt its standards to further displace American car makers, right? Europe, look at how much Europe has invested in the United States auto industry versus and how many cars they export to the United States, European cars that are on our roads. Yet, we can't export to Europe, and we can't export to third countries where Europe has agreements with, right? And we've logged these complaints against Europe repeatedly for decades, and Europe hasn't done anything. So on one hand, I think common sense dictates that, yeah, we should be able to work this stuff out and talk to them and figure out how to get our trading relationship more reciprocal. But on the other hand, this example underscores the fact that the Europeans are blatantly refusing to do it. And if there's no will there, how much, we can talk till we're blue in the face. We're not going to be able to move them. I think the Europeans are pretty adamant about, poking the United States as much as they can. And I think this is going to be their long-term strategy. And frankly, unless there's a whole sort of cultural mentality shift, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I want to come back when we get into the broader questions about sort of where do we go specifically. I get totally their recalcitrance. I can't not do a panel talking about Europe without expressing my frustration of the Airbus Boeing thing. Boeing receives a little teeny bit Airbus like that, and the WTO treats it as if they're the same. I mean, give me a break. And then the remedies. I mean, there's still subsidies going on there. So Nizak, I got to tell you, my policy solution for all this is the Europeans want digital sovereignty. I think we need luxury car sovereignty. We have to build up our luxury car industry, and then just no more Mercedes or BMWs. We'll see how that goes over. Martin, over to you.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about this whole dynamic, it really underscores the weakness of Europe's innovation ecosystem, right? And the acts like the DMA, the DSA, these digital services taxes, ultimately are giant fig leaves for the fact that Europe isn't willing to undertake some significant structural reform to improve their ability to compete on the world stage, particularly when it comes to advanced technologies. Paradoxically, the Digital Markets Act actually disincentivizes European companies to compete with US firms, because as soon as you get to be of a certain size, you get dinged for it. And so the whole approach completely flies in the face of what Mario Draghi recommended in his very important report, because he exposed the ugly truth that Europe is sclerotic, uncompetitive, and is fundamentally unwilling to address those structural deficiencies. And that's why we're seeing this proliferation of all these non-tariff attacks, primarily directed at the United States, because they're addressing US strengths, right, which is scale and platforms. And so to Nazak's point, yeah, it's going to be a very difficult process to convince the Europeans to change course, because the roots for why they're doing this are so deep and so difficult to address for themselves. It's going to be extremely challenging. Oh, you're muted, Rob.
Sorry. I think everybody who follows this had modest hopes for the Draghi report. But we'll see. It doesn't appear like it's really having as much influence. Do you think that the Europeans, well, I guess the question would be, this is, as they say, the $64,000 question. If we're threatening the Europeans with tariffs, as the president has, how much do you think that they're willing to compromise? Because they could just say, screw it, man, we're not compromising. And then, okay, we have our tariffs, they have their tariffs. That to me would be pretty stupid on their part. I think if you really, at the end of the day, if you look at a lot of these, particularly these digital attacks, they're not going to create a European digital industry. They're just not. You do that through proactive policy. So in a lot of ways, they can give up on this stuff. This is low-hanging fruit for them, in my view. I'm just curious, either your thoughts or all of your thoughts. Where do you think the Europeans are going to negotiate on any of this? And would they be willing to give up something like this in exchange for President Trump saying, well, we're not going to do as high tariffs?
Well, I think on a bilateral basis, the
Yeah.
United States has quite a bit of leverage, right? And so I think tackling the digital service taxes, there's a reasonable chance of a satisfactory outcome from the U.S. perspective. Tackling things like the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Service Act is going to be much more difficult, because then you have to deal with the EU as a bloc. And they take a lot of pride in the Brussels effect, right? Where those types of policies, GDPR, are a blueprint for how other countries think about these types of regulations. And so I think they're really going to stick to their guns on that front. So it's going to be extremely difficult for the Trump administration and subsequent administrations to really fight back against this. But it absolutely has to be done, because the last thing we want to see is things like the DMA becoming blueprint for the rest of the world, because that really goes at the heart of U.S. competitiveness in tech. And it's a fight we absolutely have to have, but it's going to be a hard slog.
I think it's a fight we have to have, and it's frankly a fight we have to win. What I think is, and to Martin's earlier point, I mean, the fact that Europe, or the notion that Europe needs this to just basically extract and attack American companies to compete, just is ridiculous when you think about, in the United States, we have a really healthy competitive ecosystem, right? We have thousands of new tech startups in Silicon Valley, And their growth is really dictated by how good their technology is, right? They don't have to take each other down. And internally in the United States, we don't have laws that allow them to take each other down. They just are, we have a healthy competitive ecosystem. So this notion that Europe has to do this to even get its tech companies to compete really underscores their lack of confidence in their companies, right? The other thing I wanted to say is just to be very blunt and frank, we are in an ecosystem of economic deterrence, right? This is where this is the direction we're going. In a weapons deterrence system, there's only so much you can do to get agreements with countries. At the end of the day, every country feels like it needs to do what's in its own national security interest, so it builds up weapons, and so we have the deterrence system. I think this is what's happening in the economic landscape. The economic war is becoming a new war. And I think countries are going to compete, are going to attack each other through these ways that we're talking about. And the only way, at least in the interim, right, for the next, I don't know how many years until there's a cultural shift, if there is one at all, is we're going to be in economic war with one another. If you do this, I'm going to do this to you. Hopefully that'll create deterrence. Where that pressure point is going to be for Europe and other countries, I don't know. The other thing that I find astounding is the way that Europe treats us versus the way it treats China, right? With Privacy Shield and all of these crazy loops that we have to jump through, that they don't allow China to jump through. And I'm going to go to Otto's example one more time, just because it's so obvious. I talked about sort of the way that the Europeans keep our autos out of the market, yet they've opened their arms to the Chinese EVs, right? And they've allowed the Chinese to decimate their market. It's the same type of a paradigm here with the attacks on the United States, but then, not having the same type of attacks to the actual country that is engaging in predatory economic practices. At the end of the day, we're in an era of economic deterrence, and I think that's going to be the name of the game until something dramatic shifts and countries understand or reach a point where they're going to have to sort of work together a little bit better.
So I want to turn to Hillel, but Nizak, I want to add an anecdote. An anecdote is not data, but it is interesting. I was in a competitiveness trade meeting at 10 Downing Street a few years ago. The Prime Minister wasn't there, but there were a number of high-level officials, including from the European Commission. And I had made a point to the British. I said, you got to do two things if you want to succeed. You got to have a robust, advanced industrial technology strategy and support your companies. And secondly, you have to push back against China and you have to join with us. And I was accused literally to my face of being a racist. And I talked to a European official afterwards, and he said, look, our view is if we can take you down, we're going to be number one. That was his view. You're the competitor, you're the threat, not China. I was amazed that he said that to me publicly. I mean, privately, he just said that to me. You're the threat. And I think they still have that. There's a great book by Jean-Jacques Scribner back from the 60s, which everybody should read, called The American Challenge. And it was about IBM and the last big tech wave after the war with mainframes and other things. And the Europeans were freaking out. And what Scribner said, he was a French guy, what he said was, this is a big challenge. We need to respond, but we need to respond by better training of our workforce, by more R&D, by real technology policies. That the last thing we should do is be to discriminate against American companies, because that'll just keep us weak. And I think European officials need to go back and read Scribner, because he had it right. Hello, your thoughts on kind of Nizak's point about can we negotiate these issues, or are we just going to be stuck with, hey, we don't like what you're doing, you don't like what we're doing?
I'm going to agree with Martin's point about the digital service taxes. So I think Trump's first administration did see some results with those after the 301 investigations. So I think if we actually started, talking about these policies, documenting them and investigating them, then you could maybe see some movement on the other side. But another issue here is that, when we push back on things like the DMA, we also have to think about our domestic policies. So our own antitrust policies are really tough on big tech, and see big tech as a evil force. And we can't really say you can't do the DMA unless we actually have consistent domestic policies.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Unfortunately, the populists in both parties have decided that large multinational corporations are a problem. So I get the whole, I think everybody's point about the DST is an important one, but let me push back a little bit on the DMA. I mean, I think it'd be great to have them move to a more consumer-oriented, consumer welfare model. And, there are places like Taiwan that we've worked with where, their head of their Fair Trade Commission is totally on board with using antitrust the right way to police abuse rather than just create structure. But I wonder I don't think we're going to get them to repeal the DMA, but why couldn't we get an agreement with our two governments to say, hey, all right, I know you're going to do that, but your fines have to be limited to X amount of money. You can't just fund your entire European Commission on the backs of technology fines of American companies. I mean, couldn't we do that? Saying, yeah, okay, if you see a problem, but these multi-billion-dollar fines, which are just atrocious, is that negotiable?
Well, I want to sort of raise one sort of question, which is, I think the DST sort of pause because of a 301 is just a sort of a short term. I wouldn't make too much of it, because if we actually convince the Europeans, at least in the Europeans' views or any other country, that they need to sort of relax or ease some of these policies. I mean, U.S. tech is an existential threat to them, right? So how much are they willing to bend to our demands if this is something of a priority for them? So I just wanted to say that I just really don't think that there's much we could say or do right now to convince them to not pursue. Not go forward more aggressively with the DMA, not maybe reinstitute DSTs, et cetera. And the other thing I wanted to just flag, at least my concern, and I know, Rob, I'm not directly answering your question, but somewhat, I just don't think that negotiation is going to be possible right now. The other thing I wanted to flag is that this is going to be a real problem for American industries who now can see much liability on their side. If Apple, for example, can't allow certain apps, or is prohibited from allowing or disallowing certain apps available on its app store, then it's going to it's going to expose Apple to huge legal liability in Europe and elsewhere. And we are maybe even on the brink of the US companies abandoning those markets because of legal liability risks, which further contracts the global market to US companies, right? If these things continue. But again, if it's that important to the Europeans, I just don't see any scenario right now in which they're going to refrain wholly from pursuing these attack measures.
Okay. Interesting. Martin?
Yeah, I think you raised an interesting point, Robin. There could well be some opportunity to at least negotiate what these overall fines look like, because ultimately it's a tax on market access by U.S. firms, and the Trump team could come up with taxes on market access for European firms and make it more expensive to do business here, which is essentially what they're doing to U.S. firms. And yes, that does risk a tit for tat type of scenario. But I think the current administration is willing to play hardball on these issues. So now's the time. All the other things that prior administrations have tried clearly haven't worked. So it might be time to come up with some new approaches and show that we're taking this very seriously and are willing to escalate this in a way that prior administrations have not done.
Martin,
before.
let me ask you a bit. if we can convince the Europeans to sort of relax their regulatory measures, that will threaten their growth, right? And so are they going to take the risk of impeding their digital tech industry's growth by relaxing the discriminatory measures and the attacks against American companies? I just think that that's going to be sort of a hard pill for them to swallow.
Well, the reasons for why European tech companies are having such a hard time, it's not going to be addressed by these types of measures. I mean, there need to be structural reforms in labor laws, worker mobility. Just the dearth of venture capital is a huge problem in Europe. So there's so much more to the underlying reasons for why Europe is struggling in these technology areas. And that's a dialogue that should be part of the discussions with the EU and individual European countries to underscore that their approach now isn't going to get the results that they're looking for. And I'm sure that will be greeted with skepticism, but there are people in Europe that understand this. And I think the Draghi report is a good example of that. And a lot of entrepreneurs are, frankly, they don't agree with a lot of EU policies because of that regulation over everything approach. It's holding them back. So I think there is an undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the way Brussels is approaching these issues. And I think that's also then part of the reason why you're seeing a real switch in national elections in which parties are getting the support because of that underlying frustration. So you may well see a shifting attitude just through the results of all the national elections taking place. So I wouldn't look at the EU as this monolith in that sense. I think there's some interesting debates happening below the radar that are not really on front of mind for most news outlets right now. But I think there is a window of opportunity if through some strong negotiating tactics on the part of Washington that we can actually see some tangible results in
maybe. And I think the other point is that watching how close Europe is getting with China too, sort of an argument for the other way, right? I think at the end of the day, we're not going to know, but even if there's dissatisfaction in Europe with what, as you said, Brussels is doing, there's also a huge movement for Europe to sort of to gain closer ties with China. And that also means, elbowing out the United States. So
exactly.
It's complicated to see how this is going to turn out.
One, Martin, your point about this hurting them, and so Zach, what I would argue to them would be, I'd say, okay, imagine a scenario where you don't have any American cloud providers. Which model do you think overall European growth and innovation will prosper in? Your ineffective, less innovative, less comprehensive cloud providers, where you have some cloud jobs, but bad cloud services? What the Europeans don't seem to understand is that you can maybe grow through this pressure, some technology companies, but you're going to get suboptimal technology, and that's going to hurt all of your companies. So I don't want to talk about Europe anymore. We've exhausted that topic. So I think the rest of the world exists. Let's move over to the Commonwealth, the developed Commonwealth countries, particularly UK and Canada and Australia. The Canadians, to me, strike me as a country that could easily do a deal. There's a bunch of things they do. I don't know, maybe you can talk about some of the problematic things the Canadians are doing on tech. I guess the question is, does the new prime minister want to negotiate those, and does the president want to accept a negotiation? Seemed quite unclear from the last meeting that the president even wanted negotiation, which I found troubling. But Hillel, what are some of the things we have that list of things? What are some of the things the Canadians are doing?
Yeah, so in addition to digital service taxes, they have this online news act, which basically forces American digital platforms to pay like mandatory payment schemes to local news agencies or like news publishers for just displaying their link. So basically, you have a news article, you want to post it somewhere, they want the news agency to be paid through a mandatory payment scheme. And another thing that they're doing is these like network fees. So charging, for example, Netflix for a user streaming some TV show, even though the user is already paying for the internet service, in addition to digital service taxes.
So, we have a new center up in Canada focusing on these issues, and I feel like Canadians are a little bit like the Europeans. They're and I say this as a dual citizen. I was born in Canada. I feel like their feelings got hurt, and now they're all upset. And at the end of the day, this is business. This isn't emotions. We're not married to each other. We're doing business with each other. And so I feel like the Canadians have gotten kind of put themselves in a corner. But to me, there's an easy deal to be made. There are certain problems the Canadians have. Everybody knows what their trade barriers are, and they should be able to make some compromises. So I guess the question is, I think that's an easier nut to crack than the Europeans, partly because Carney controls the whole country as opposed to Europe and all this, different countries and the Commission fighting. But I guess the question maybe is, does anybody have insight into the president's mind about where he wants to go with this? Because I think there's a deal to be made with Canada, and I would like the deal to be made. I think we do have to create a North American production system to help fight back against the Chinese. I don't want to see us go it alone unless we have to. So we should at least try. So I don't know, Nazak, what do you think? Is there?
Yeah, I actually am working fairly closely on the U.S.-Canada sort of relationship. And I will say that I think it's a lot of posturing. And I think we're going to get a deal with Canada for one of the main reasons being, other than sort of, they're a neighbor and our defense sector and our ecosystems are integrated, is because Canada has heavy rare earths. We have light rare earths. Canada has heavy rare earths. We need permanent magnets. China's going to cut us off our access to permanent magnets again. Our defense primes are already not getting permanent magnets. Whether anybody likes it or not, we have to be partners. We have to get along because we have a strategic asset. Canada has a strategic asset, and those assets need to be combined to enable our commercial and military sectors. And the U.S. government knows about that. The president, the White House, the Department of Defense, they all know the criticality of this. So I actually think that with the G7, there's a lot of discussions with Ambassador Hillman, U.S. Ambassador Hoekstra to Canada, lots of sort of, they're getting a lot of sort of talking points about where we can, the steps we need to take to get to an agreement. And I am fairly confident that at some point between now and the end of summer, we're going to have some framework agreement with Canada. Posturing aside, again, it's going to be a matter of necessity. And I think this whole rare earth thing is becoming the main driving force. With that, just with respect to Canada's sort of digital discrimination and attacks, I do think we have a USMCA dispute resolution mechanism. And so I think Canada, unlike Europe, really doesn't see the United States as a rival. And so we're more able to leverage USMCA to resolve our disputes versus with Europe and other countries, we're going to have to go through the WTO, which is sort of, for reasons I said earlier, is just going to be more difficult to get a fair outcome through them.
Okay. So going back to the other side of the Atlantic, the UK, as we all know, the president just put the baseline tariffs, which everybody gets on the UK, partly because they don't run a trade surplus with us. But at the same time, as close as we are, they remind me a little bit about Canada. You know, they're doing some things that are not appropriate. Hillel, do you have a couple of examples of what the UK is doing in that space that we've documented? I don't mean to put you on the spot, you know, memory of 112 things we've written.
Yeah, so basically, in addition to the GDPR that we talked about and, you know, discriminatory fines on American tech companies, 80% of the fines being basically paid by American companies. We also have things like cloud restrictions, for example, restricting American tech companies from offering cloud services, especially in public sectors, for example, even though they don't really have a good alternative, or like forcing local data localization. In addition to things like Online Safety Act, that's, you know, again, imposes massive fines, you know, based on revenue shares again.
Yeah, that's a whole nother issue there, that the criminalization, I won't go too far down that rat hole. The criminalization of speech in the UK is, I think, really, really shocking. And we see that in some other European countries as well. I saw it in Brazil. I guess there's this guy going to jail for 8 years. So some comedian, I don't know if people have seen that one. That's unbelievable. He's appealing his sentence, but just doing a comedy act, 8 years in jail for saying things that were rude, which is what a lot of comedy is. So, Martin, thoughts on that? I mean, one of the things that we've pushed for, I think this is such a low-hanging fruit. I know a lot of people were critical of it. I don't know. I also, I think we should have we should include the UK in USMCA, just expand it out, use that as a base of kind of a firm, hard, solid base, and then put it out gradually, not like we did with the TPP, which was too big, too fast, with really strict rules, and see if the UK wants to be part of that. And then we could have a dispute mechanism. So, you know, thoughts on where do we go with the UK, and are they willing to negotiate?
I mean, I can start. I think
Sure.
The president really likes the European prime minister. They just have a really good relationship, and I think that the first trade deal that we got with Starmer and Trump was pretty significant, not because of what it had, but because it showed that these two countries value each other's relationships and are willing to work more. And I think, from what I understand, Starmer is sort of putting the rollback of some of UK's regulations on the table to sort of get a better deal with Trump. And so, and I love your point, Rob, about including UK in something like USMCA, although we're going to have to rename it. More letters in the acronym, but I think the UK is a country in which it genuinely wants to work closely with the United States, and because of Brexit, they have no choice. They really need to develop their markets outside of the EU, and you know, frankly, they saw what being tied to the EU can do, the way it can hurt their economy. So they need a relief valve. The USMCA is a great partner. Starmer, Trump really seem to like each other. They're putting things on the table to negotiate. They've demonstrated flexibility. I think this is a great model of how the US and other countries can approach solving these issues.
Yeah, I agree with Nazak. Pragmatism will prevail, particularly in that bilateral relationship.
So I want to switch to an audience question here, which so the question is, the U.S. arguably risks losing its soft power influence in Europe day by day. I would expand that to say other countries as well. Isn't there a risk that these policies and proposals entrench an anti-U.S. view? I guess that's the first question. The second question is that worth, if that's true, is it worth for what it is we hope we gain?
I mean, yeah, I think they do entrench an anti-US view, and I think it's going to be really delicate of how we need soft power. We need presence in countries abroad. Frankly, we need to be building data centers, right? We've got incredible data center hyperscalers chip technology, and we need to be building data centers abroad, which is partly why I'm glad that BIS, the Commerce Department, repealed the AI diffusion rule. They're going to replace it with something, I'm confident, that's stronger, that still just allows hyperscalers, AI data centers to allow Chinese access. But soft power is going to be incredibly important. And if there is a deterrence rate for US companies to be there with this sort of US imperialist views, that's going to be harmful. But I do want to say that there is a silver lining in all of this, even though this is what's happening, the anti-US views. We see what happened in the Middle East. The Saudis, Middle Eastern countries, stemming from President Trump's visit, they want the US technology. They're opening up their borders. They're saying, come build data centers here. They're allowing our companies to control their data centers. They're investing enormously in US companies. They've selected the Middle Eastern companies have selected US companies as the companies to partner with, to invest in, to have them build abroad in recognition of US technology, but also in recognition that the US is a good partner to do business with. So perhaps some of the movement that we're making in the Middle East demonstrates US tech diplomacy, demonstrates the US being a good actor in these partnerships, and maybe some of the anti-US views will roll back, starting from these sort of unlikely partnerships that we're developing, but are going to be important partnerships in and of themselves and signaling tools.
Hillel or Martin, thoughts on that? How do we fight the fight that we need to fight, given that we're running a $1 trillion plus trade deficit and losing share in our advanced industries, but at the same time, not piss everybody off?
Want to go ahead, Hillel, or I can jump in? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. It's going to be a delicate balance, right? But the U.S. image throughout the world, it's cyclical. If you look over just in going back to the World War II period, there's peaks and valleys. We're definitely in a valley right now, but at the end of the day, given what the United States stands for, what it offers to the rest of the world, that's ultimately the foundation of soft power, and we can put that back in an upswing. It's definitely not a reason to not aggressively pursue these types of attacks on the United States, these non-tariff attacks. So it's something that the Department of State in particular will have to be very cognizant of. But at this very moment, Jake Helberg is having his confirmation hearing for Undersecretary of State for Economy, and he'll be a pivotal figure in helping to build up America's image on these very issues. So, with folks like Jake and others at the Department of State and throughout the U.S. government, I'm confident that we'll get things back on track from a soft power perspective.
I mean, I guess I would want to add that there's also this aspect of like the US politics being a little bit unstable. So other countries may not trust that, they can have a long-term partnership with the US. Even in this year, courts struck down some of the tariffs. So why would other countries even start negotiating if they think that the tariffs might go away on their own? So that's a problem. But I think American big tech companies do have a big role to play in building long-term permanent partnerships in these other countries, like the data centers. So actually, it might be good to push back on these attacks so that these companies can actually operate in these other countries to, be the U.S. influence in these, other countries.
Yeah. One of the issues, that's an excellent point. The more we can get our companies there, making money, also spreading our business culture, our overall culture, which is fantastic. Martin, you raised a good point. And also, I think we have to recognize that the Secretary Rubio is a different kind of Secretary of State, I believe, because he comes to this with a deep understanding of these techno-economic issues. And I don't think any prior Secretary of State has done that before. They were all about comedy. They were all about, the State Department's job is to keep everybody our friend. And so whenever there was pushback in the trade world, you always had state, or maybe almost always had state saying, calm down, slow down. And so that's one of the things I think is different now. And you're right. I think that's a job for the State Department to really push forward on. That's one of the problems I have with I can imagine the Republicans wanting to cut the not the World Bank, the Exim Bank, and some of the other, and we eliminated aid. I do think DFC. I think these programs are critical, not just for helping American companies get market access, particularly against the Chinese in these, if you will, sort of third market countries, but they're also critical in terms of just our overall goodwill and soft power. And I think that's penny wise and pound foolish what we're doing there.
I want to add, I think you're right, Rob. And President Trump's, there's a number of executive orders that sort of double down on the importance of DFC. And I think Exim Bank too. So I think those programs are going to stay and actually grow. I also think that, and I'm going to go back to critical minerals and rare earths. It's really important. Sort of overlay of what's happening globally, but with China's flexing its muscles and restricting access of permanent magnets to the rest of the world, certainly permanent magnets are incredibly important for motors and cell phones and other tech products too. The epicenter of an ex-China permanent magnet, rare earth, critical mineral supply chain is actually happening in the United States. It's not happening in any other country. And so whether countries like it or not, the only alternative, and this is really a testament to US leadership. We started all of this in Trump 1.0. We put forward a federal strategy, wrote an executive order, et cetera, on critical minerals. And my point is, in a couple of years, I think, as we really scale up critical mineral, rare earth, permanent magnet production, I think countries are going to have two options: to either ally with the United States or ally with China. And I think that they're starting to recognize the issues and constraints and the manipulation and coercion that stems from China. So I actually think right now the posturing, whatever, but once this critical sector that every country in the world depends on emerges in the United States, and the only options are going to be US and China, I think we're going to see a shift in the way that countries are behaving with respect to the United States.
That's a really excellent point. As I think the China challenge becomes more clear to these countries, like there's a good study by Mercator Institute in Germany. I think that's the right name.
Yeah, Merrick's for short.
Merrick's. And they did a great study showing that the alignment of where China is good is much closer to where Europe is good. And so the threats from China are actually more severe. Chemicals, automobiles, machine tools, those are all European strengths. Nazak, I can't resist when you talk about magnets, thinking about one of the there's so many huge mistakes we made, but MagnaQuench, an American magnet company, spun off of GM, and we let the Chinese buy it. Oh my gosh. I also want to come back to the DFC thing, Development Finance Corporation. We did a report last year where we showed that over half of their funding went to companies in countries that were on the US 301 watch list for IP theft, or that had consistently and strongly opposed data and imposed data localization. DFC's response was, that's none of our business. We don't care. So I think one of the things that I'm hoping the Trump administration can do is align our policy. So it's not just tariffs, but why are we rewarding countries that are doing harmful things to our companies? We're rewarding them. There's plenty of demand for DFC funding in other places. So I don't know if people think that's something that is good or think something that might happen, a better cross-agency alignment.
Rob, that's such an excellent point, because I think that what I haven't seen, having done this world for a really long time, what I haven't seen happen until recently is the U.S. government being vocal about other countries' discriminatory practices. USTR kind of used to collect this information. It would go in a cute little wonky 900-page report that nobody would read. Now, putting aside the calculation of the how we got to the various reciprocal tariffs aside, there were alternative ways of doing it. Just this notion of the way that countries are discriminating against the United States, I see as sort of penetrated every federal agency, and the way they're thinking about things in a way that's been truly unprecedented. So Rob, really your point is spot on. And I think this is the first time every federal agency is now thinking about what is this other, how is this other country discriminating or not discriminating in the United States, and do we need to put our resources there to further embolden that country to do good things or bad things? So there's a shift that's happening that is long overdue.
Yeah, when I made my comment about DFC kind of ignoring this, that was a year ago. That was before the Trump administration. So I agree with you that this is long overdue. That agencies can't sort of have these blinders on this narrow mission. It has to be part of the broader mission of which the president has articulated.
And I actually I haven't seen until very recently cabinet members, each of them being able to articulate what other countries are doing that are harmful, right?
Yeah.
If you actually asked them before, they'd be like, Canada, I don't know, I think they're our friend. But now, I mean, they are a friend. But now, we had Lutnick articulating the issues with Canada, other cabinet members doing the same. Peter Navarro's on TV. He's always done that. But it's just the level of understanding, I think, among cabinet members is so different now, and members of Congress, it's so different now that we've made a movement in the positive direction. But you're right, like even up to last year, head in the sand, right? We can't do that anymore.
Yeah, I testified at the House Oversight Committee. Geez, I don't remember. Maybe I think it might have been earlier this year, or late last year. I can't remember. So if it had been this year, it was very early on in the Trump administration, and the Republican chairman had done it was a really fantastic project. Their staff had asked every single agency, like all the way down to like SBA. I mean, not just the major cabinet agencies. How are you thinking about the China threat? How was that incorporated into your own thinking? And what they found was that it was hit and miss. Like, yeah, some were okay, and some were just, it wasn't even on the radar screen. I thought that kind of analysis and bringing it to light, it was really important. And obviously this administration has doubled down on that and made sure that that's even stronger. So there's one more question I want to get to, but before I do that, I want to ask again, this is the other $64,000 question. I remember we did an event probably 6-7 years ago where we had 3 former USTRs or our deputy to USTRs. And one of the points we made is that trade policy should not be industry agnostic. There's some industries that are just more important to the long-term future and power of the U.S. And they all disagreed with that, which I get. They're the politics of soybeans and all that stuff. But I guess my question for you all is, are we able to prioritize key strategic industries, like digital, like AI, like automobiles, as opposed to, do we sell some Kentucky whiskey overseas? And I'm all for selling Kentucky whiskey, but at the end of the day, I don't really care. I know you're not supposed to say that, but ultimately negotiations are about choices and picking what you're going to go to the mattresses on and what you're not. So in other words, are we able to adequately incorporate these non-tariff attacks on American tech companies, or is it just going to be one thing that's just the same as soybeans?
Well, I would say absolutely yes, we're capable, and we absolutely should. what the United States is lacking, unfortunately, is a comprehensive national strategy for technology. And that's ultimately what you need, right? You need to be able to look out 30, 40 years and say, this is what we want to achieve. This is where we want to be as a nation, and then work your way backwards to figure out how do you get there. By doing an exercise like that, you can start identifying which technology areas are going to be essential in order to make that desired outcome a reality. And clearly, there's going to be a few technology areas that are going to be more important than others. I think the challenge that we have as a nation is having honest discussions about the trade-offs that need to happen, because this isn't. Well, I think one of the interesting things about the United States is we often want to be the absolute best at everything, but given the diffusion of technology and just the sheer expense that goes into being the absolute best at everything, that's just not realistic anymore. And so we have to pick and choose where we want to excel and identify areas where it's okay to be, competitive, but not necessarily the best, or even be a fast follower. And that's actually a strategy that China does in a lot of tech areas, as they look to see what the global leaders are doing, avoid the mistakes and detours that are made, and then you can get to pretty close to the same point with a lot less expense. And so I would really encourage the current administration to think about, where should the United States unquestionably be the best, and are there areas where it's okay to not be quite at the pinnacle? And that's a discussion, unfortunately, people do not like having, because there's very strong voices to promote, well, we have to be the absolute best in this subset of biotech, but also in quantum information science and all these fields in AI. It's extremely complex, but I think as a country, we're absolutely capable of doing that, because we have the right strategic mindset to be able to do it. It's just very difficult, and there's going to be people that are upset and disappointed with the outcome. So that's the main reason why we haven't done it yet. There's just too many constituencies to please.
I'll also add that, so far the narrative has been for U.S. industrial growth has been jobs, manufacturing, investments, and then sort of second order of magnitude has been sort of infrastructure and energy. We don't really talk about U.S. tech leadership. So when the U.S. government is thinking about its approach by industries and saying, oh, I need this and this, we have this many jobs in the United States, we're missing the fact that we are becoming assemblers, right? All the high-tech stuff is going overseas. And when we look at numbers and all the investments in the United States, and so wants to invest and bring jobs, et cetera, are you bringing technology that's not really part of the discussion in the way it needs to be? And really, I want to also emphasize, over time, even with the ups and downs on the job number, we have become assemblers, and the high-tech stuff has been offshoring more and more. So when we restructure what our priorities are, and Rob and Martin, your points are excellent, it has to be jobs, like Trump has emphasized, manufacturing, investments, infrastructure. It also has to be tech leadership. That's going to be that's going to be the fifth element of what we talk about. And it has to be, if we're going to become and remain the technological powerhouse of the world. Right now, it's the fifth element isn't there. It needs to be.
Hear, hear. I had the pleasure of being at a award dinner last week where Commerce Secretary Lutnick spoke, and he brought up this point on it just on his own in his speech. He said, some people say that we want to bring t-shirt factories back to the U.S., and he said, absolutely not. We want to make America the most advanced manufacturing powerhouse in the world, with advanced technologies, high levels of automation. So I was very pleased to hear that, because I know that sometimes the narrative, particularly in Peter Navarro, sometimes is just kind of all manufacturing all the time. And I thought Commerce Secretary Lutnick had a more nuanced and realistic and strategic view that, yeah, we need to do a lot more of this, but it's really about power and leadership. And you don't get that from making T-shirts. You get that from making vehicles, drugs, quantum computers, et cetera, et cetera.
And the other difficult element about this is, as we are manufacturing high-tech things, the equipment to manufacturing high-tech things we don't even have the know-how to make those anymore.
I know.
So when we look at this problem, I think that the magnitude of the problem is pretty significant. And I think the more the US government, I think, is starting to become aware of it as they're trying to bring manufacturing here. They're faced with, where do we get the equipment from? But I hope through these discussions, if we keep our foot on the gas pedal, we can help that narrative evolve in even a more sort of proactive way.
Yeah, completely agree. Automation and robotics is the only way that the United States is going to become a manufacturing powerhouse again, right? I mean, just look at shipbuilding. In order for the United States to have a competitive shipbuilding industry, infrastructure problems aside, we just don't have the people that know how to build ships anymore, at least not in a sufficient quantity to even come close to matching the output of South Korea or China. So yeah, I think going all in on automation and robotics would be the only way to have a true renaissance in manufacturing here in the United States.
This will tell you exactly how totally wonky I am. But one of my favorite things to do is do walkthrough tours of American production facilities, whether they're drug companies, aerospace companies, auto companies. One of the things I always do is I look at the machine tools and I look at what country they're made. Germany, Korea, Japan. I mean, some in the US. I don't want to say we don't make anything, but that's a real problem. So 100% agree with you. Martin, your point about shipbuilders, I was over in Seoul for a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to folks about that, and they said there's now a partnership with a big Korean shipbuilding company in the Philly shipyard. And I was told by the Koreans that they were blown away at how antiquated the production process was. It's just way, way low tech compared to what the Koreans are using in their. So that's something we have to embrace if we're going to get there. There is a question I do want to get to, just sort of related to the topic, but we'll ask it anyway. China EVs are technically the best engineered and best value for money in the world. Why would Europe deprive its consumers of these, apart from the obvious security threats? I know the answer, or my answer, but Nazak, why don't you give us your thoughts?
So they are well engineered, and when one steps in a BYD, it's basically a Tesla, right? And so China's well engineered cars are truly a product of technology theft, technology misappropriation, and China's low prices in these sectors are in part because of its non-market economic structure, where the government pulls the levers of land, labor, electricity, raw material prices to underprice, is a function of forced labor. And it's a function of massive Chinese subsidies and supports purposely driven to get these, pun intended, purposely driven to get these costs so far below any other market economy's costs to decimate our industry. So I personally have a huge problem with getting Chinese EVs, regardless of whether the technology is good or not, because we're now condoning forced labor, we're condoning Chinese subsidies, we're condoning Chinese market manipulation, and we're condoning Chinese theft and IP misappropriation. And what kind of sort of country are we if we're condoning all of these things, primarily, forced labor? So, for all of those reasons, I think we need to call out the migration and the problems towards, and the migration towards, and the problems associated with Chinese EVs, so we can at least, on principle, help force the Chinese out of the global markets.
Martin?
Completely agree. We would be rewarding China's techno-mercantilist policies. That is completely nonsensical in my mind.
Yeah, but we get cheap stuff. Get cheap stuff. I don't want to sacrifice for the good of the country, man. I want my cheap stuff now.
Rob, I got to answer that question, and I'm going to put my economist hat on now, and because it's really important for folks to understand that, because we hear, all of us, right? We hear this argument over and over again, and I say 2 points, and they're related. One, sort of Adam Smith's comparative advantage model was premised on the notion that there was market forces driving competition, right? So competition was fair, and market forces allocated sort of who did what and allocated resources. When you have a non-market economy actor that comes into the system, it distorts the system. The system falls apart. You can't have no comparative advantage with a distortive actor. And the second related point is that if it's, we were the United States and the rest of the world, we were stronger 25 years ago before China's entry into the WTO, stronger economically and militarily. And China has steadily hollowed out our industries and taken away technology. And the reason that that's relevant is that its predatory economic practices have made our economies more unstable. The more we move production to China to avail ourselves of its non-market forces, the more we buy Chinese cheap goods to avail ourselves of its cheap price structure, the more we're allowing China's non-market forces to penetrate the global economy and dictate the rules of the global economy rather than the market system model. And frankly, the more we do this, we're accelerating the demise of the market-based system in capitalism. And I think that's a huge problem that folks generally forget to mention.
I was in a meeting in the Obama administration in the White House talking to a senior economist that I know, and we were in the, I think it was in the OEOB, and I was saying, oh, how's it going? What are you doing? Oh, he said, I was just in a meeting, and we all know who the economist is, so I can't say his name, but I was just in a senior meeting with this, and it was on Chinese solar panels, and the view of this senior economics team was, oh yeah, if they're stupid enough to give us subsidized solar panels, and we don't take them, then we're being the ones that are stupid because they're giving us free stuff. And that was the attitude. And they didn't realize that, well, they'd massively stolen our intellectual property. They'd subsidized it. And then they closed their market to our panels. And my favorite story on that one was they bankrupted a whole lot of US solar companies. And then there was an IP case in LA where they went to buy their assets at 10 cents on the dollar. And they bought up all of their patents. So they destroy them, put them into bankruptcy, and then go and buy their patents. And we're supposed to reward that. So I want to, we got just a few minutes left. Hillel, maybe start with you. Or maybe I'll end with you, Hillel. The overall sort of purpose of what we're trying to do in this, both this event and the work and the documentation we have of over 120 of these cases on our website, and the Aegis Project generally, is to just raise awareness that we're in a world now that's not just about barriers of us getting in, but it's about attacks coming back. And those attacks are systematic, they're strategic, and we've got to sort of think about that and integrate that into how we think about trade policy and how we execute trade policy. So with that, I don't know, maybe Martin, last comments on that? Are you optimistic that project, I don't mean our project, but the broad project for the country, will be going in the right direction on this?
Yeah, I commend ITIF for doing this work. I think these issues are widely unknown and misunderstood. And once the general public understands what U.S. companies are facing, there will be a lot more support for the types of actions that the current administration is taking, for example, because all of a sudden, yes, people understand, like, there's some seriously unfair practices taking place, squarely targeting U.S. companies for no other matter than they're really good at what they do, and they do it better than anyone else in the world. And that, at the end of the day, is just flies in the face of everything that we stand for. So no, I think Rob, the work that you and the team are doing is very, very important. And yeah, just thank you for taking the initiative on this, because I don't see anyone else in Washington taking a systematic approach to these types of analyses.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Nazak.
Yeah, I agree with Martin. I mean, I think for every critical issue, these are critical issues. These are issues that are going to dictate the future of America and American technological leadership and American soft power, as an earlier question flagged, right? And if we're not educated, if policymakers aren't educated, if the American public isn't educated, if American business leaders aren't educated, then they're going to advocate for the wrong type of policy. So I think education is key. But then I want to also double down on something Martin said. ITIF's reputation. This is not sort of just a gratuitous plug, but ITIF is the one sort of institution that doesn't feel like it's encumbered by other interests, and can actually put information out there in a sort of a credible, non-biased way, which is why at least for me, it's a go-to resource if I actually just need to know the facts devoid of bias from industry, from trading partners, et cetera. So I think you all have the ideal platform for disseminating this kind of information. And like I said, Congress, everybody, if we're not adequately educated about the problems, then we're going to miss the mark on solutions. And it's real that America misses the mark on solutions, because we're in this mess with China and the rest of the world to begin with, because we just haven't had good, credible information out there and accessible to policymakers, the business community, et cetera. Commend ITIF. I think the more you get things out there, the more you can kind of shape the conversation in DC and internationally.
Well, I'm really glad we had Martin and Nazak on this panel. I mean, that was the whole purpose of this, was the last 3 minutes of your comments. That was a joke. Thank you for the praise.
But it was sincere. It was absolutely sincere.
I recognize and really do appreciate that. That's so nice of you to say. Hillel, I'll have you have the last word before I say thank you, everybody.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to add that U.S. tech companies are the force driving American innovation. They invest billions of dollars in R&D. And without a strong U.S. tech industry, the United States cannot win the competition against China. So it's really important that we defend the U.S. tech leadership by defending U.S. tech companies, in addition to strengthening them. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the reports that Hillel is working on, we hope to have it out soon, is this point about American tech companies invest more in R&D than the entire UK economy does. Just to use one example, they invest about a quarter of what the Chinese invest. So they're incredible resources. And what's interesting in this new report is we're looking at not just what they're investing in information systems. We all know they're investing in better search. We all know they're investing in AI. But in other areas, we talked about robotics, healthcare innovation, believe it or not, agricultural innovation. So they're not just doing the narrow things we think they're doing. The R&D that they're producing and related companies is much broader and critical to our nation's future. So with that, I want to thank Hillel for the PowerPoint slides and the great presentation. And then, of course, Nazak and Martin, it's great to have you guys on the panel. It's great to work with you. The voices in our club are not as broad as they should be. And so it's always great to get together with two folks who are more or less on the same page that we're on, because we need everybody who's in that to work together to move the agenda forward. So, and thank you for everybody on the panel. We appreciate it. And please feel free, or encourage you to share a link to the event when it's up with your colleagues and friends. So thank you so much, and everybody have a good day.